Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Yolanda Whitaker, and for almost 10 years, I was married to Preston Whitaker, a man I mistook for ordinary because he never needed to advertise how powerful he was. Preston was 52 when the illness began to change the shape of our marriage. I was 34, beautiful in a way I had learned to use, and convinced that life owed me brightness, attention, movement, and admiration. Preston had always been steady. He preferred evenings in our Boston brownstone with jazz humming from the turntable, books stacked beside his chair, and a quiet smile that made people trust him before he ever explained himself. I used to think that calmness was strength. Later, when the house grew quiet and his body grew weaker, I called it dullness. I called it a cage. One morning, after weeks of watching him move slowly from bed to chair and chair to bed, I slammed my coffee cup down hard enough for the sound to echo through the kitchen. I said, "I cannot keep living like this, Preston. I did not sign up to be a nurse." He looked at me for a long moment, not angry, not surprised, only tired in a way that made me feel seen and exposed. Preston said, "You took vows, Yolanda." I folded my arms and looked away from him because I could not stand the gentleness in his voice. I said, "And you are dragging me down with you." The illness had not arrived all at once. It began with fatigue that Preston tried to dismiss as age and overwork. Then came the weight loss, the shortness of breath, the pain he hid until it bent him over in private. By the time specialists at Massachusetts General confirmed advanced pancreatic cancer, his life had already been divided into before and after. The doctor spoke carefully, but I heard enough. Aggressive, limited options. Months, perhaps longer if treatment slowed the spread. At first, I played the devoted wife because that was the role everyone expected. I brought him tea. I adjusted his pillows. I sat beside him during appointments with my hand resting over his, aware of nurses and doctors watching us with sympathy. But caregiving was not glamorous. Medication schedules were not romantic. The house no longer felt like a place where I was admired. It felt like a sick room, and every soft beep, every prescription bottle, every careful meal made me feel older than I wanted to be. Preston noticed my impatience before I admitted it to myself. He noticed when I began taking longer walks that turned into late lunches, then dinners, then entire evenings away. He noticed when my perfume changed and my phone stayed face down on every table. He did not accuse me at first. That made it worse. Calvin Greer began visiting more often during that period. He had been Preston's friend for more than 20 years, the kind of man who wore charm like a tailored coat. Calvin had a smooth voice, silver at his temples, and a reputation for business deals that sounded more impressive than they really were. Preston trusted him because Calvin had stood beside him at weddings, funerals, board dinners, and difficult negotiations. What Preston did not know then was that Calvin had perfected the art of appearing loyal in public while feeding his appetites in private. He was careful. He never lingered too long when Gloria Bennett, our house manager and later Preston's caregiver, was nearby. He parked down the block when he came after dark. He texted me from numbers I saved under other names. The security cameras at the brownstone covered the front entrance and alley gate, but Calvin knew which side street had no clear view. I told myself it was only conversation at first. Calvin told me I was too young to spend my best years watching a man fade. He said, "Yolanda, you were made for more than pill bottles and quiet rooms." I wanted to believe him because his words made me feel chosen instead of trapped. Gloria had been with Preston for nearly 10 years. First as a household manager who handled the staff, appointments, travel arrangements, and private events. Then as the person who stayed when illness made everything harder. She was not loud with her loyalty. She simply remained. Preston's younger sister, Denise Whitaker, flew in from Seattle whenever she could, sometimes for only 2 days at a time, sitting beside him with old photo albums and homemade soup she knew he would barely touch. I watched Denise move around the house without asking for attention. She never posted photographs of herself at his bedside. She never turned his illness into a performance of goodness. I resented her for that because she made my impatience harder to hide. There were moments when I almost felt ashamed. I would see Preston asleep with one hand open on the blanket, and I would remember how that same hand had held mine crossing busy streets, how he had warmed my car in winter, how he had remembered small things I mentioned once and never asked for again. Then my phone would buzz with Calvin's name, and guilt would become irritation. I chose the easier feeling. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I entered Preston's room with his suitcase standing behind me like a witness. He was propped against the pillows, thinner than he used to be, but his eyes still held that steady dignity I once admired. I had rehearsed my speech in Calvin's borrowed Mercedes outside. I told myself I was choosing life. I told myself Preston would understand. But when I stood in front of him, the words came out colder than I intended. I said, "I cannot do this anymore. I will not waste my youth watching you fade away." Preston's hand rested on the blanket. His wedding ring hung loose around his finger. He said, "So that is it. After everything." I lifted my chin because I needed pride to cover the ugliness of what I was doing. I said, "I need more than this. Calvin understands me. He can give me the life I deserve." For a moment, the only sound was rain against the window. Then Preston looked at me with a faint curve at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, but something that unsettled me more than anger would have. Preston said, "Then go. I hope you find what you are looking for." I expected him to shout. I expected him to beg me not to leave, to call Calvin a snake, to accuse me of betrayal. Instead, Preston gave me permission with a calmness that felt like a door closing from the inside. I wheeled my suitcase through the hall, past Gloria, who stood near the staircase with tears in her eyes, but said nothing. Outside, Calvin waited in a black Mercedes that I later learned was leased under a business account already months behind on payments. At the time, it looked expensive enough to confirm every lie I wanted to believe. I climbed in beside him, and when we pulled away from the brownstone, I did not look back. Inside that house, Preston later told Gloria to open every curtain. He said the rooms needed light. That was the first thing that should have frightened me. A man who had just been abandoned by his wife while dying did not collapse. He let the sunlight in. Preston was not worth a little money. He was not merely comfortable. He had built a logistics empire from a small Boston shipping operation in his 20s, expanded it through the e-commerce boom, and quietly invested in technology firms, commercial property, medical research companies, and private funds that most people never heard about until they became impossible to ignore. He did not live like a man worth hundreds of millions because he disliked performance. Our brownstone was beautiful but not vulgar. Our cars were elegant but not flashy. He had accountants, attorneys, trustees, and advisors, but I rarely paid attention to that side of his life because I preferred the parts one could wear, photograph, or show off. I knew he had money. I did not know the scale. Preston had protected the true structure of his wealth through family trusts, business entities, and private holdings established long before marriage. Before our wedding, I had signed a prenuptial agreement that his attorney explained carefully. At the time, I told myself it did not matter because I loved Preston and because I believed his life with me would always include comfort. I had signed without imagining the document would one day become a wall I could not climb. After I left, Preston called his attorney, Martin Whitfield, a disciplined man trained at Howard Law who had represented him for nearly 25 years. Preston did not keep deeds, portfolios, and account records scattered beside his bed like a reckless man. What he had in a leather-bound folder on his nightstand were summaries, prepared estate documents, trust instructions, letters, medical capacity records, and notes for Martin. Preston had been planning to reveal the full picture of his estate on our 10th wedding anniversary, which was only months away. He had commissioned a diamond necklace, not as a public display, but as a private gift designed with 3 small stones hidden near the clasp, one for each major season of our marriage. Our first year, the year his mother died, and the year we rebuilt after a miscarriage I rarely spoke about. I did not know any of that when I walked out. I only knew I was tired of illness and wanted to feel admired again. My departure rewrote everything. Martin did not simply erase my name with a pen and a dramatic flourish. Preston was too precise for that. Over the next week, while his doctors confirmed in writing that his mind remained clear and competent, Martin brought witnesses, revised trust documents, updated beneficiary instructions, and prepared a formal statement citing my abandonment, my legal separation filing, and the infidelity Preston had documented through private investigators only after I left. That last part one did not learn until later. Preston had not been blind. He had been quiet. He had seen enough to know I was not confused. I was choosing. Because of the prenuptial agreement, the trust structure, and my own separation filing, I had far less claim than I assumed. Preston directed the largest portion of his estate to Denise. Another significant share went to the Preston Whitaker Legacy Foundation, a scholarship program for students in underfunded neighborhoods, a pediatric cancer wing, and long-serving staff who had remained loyal without demanding anything from him. Gloria was named with dignity. Denise was named with love. I was named only in explanation. Preston was not punishing me because he was petty. That was the hardest truth to accept later. He did not move my share because he wanted to wound me. He moved it because my actions had revealed something his illness had made impossible to ignore. Denise loved him when he could offer her nothing glamorous. Gloria cared for him when the work was quiet and exhausting. His staff protected his privacy when gossip would have made them important. I had wanted the title of wife, the security of his name, and the benefits of his life, but when the marriage required sacrifice instead of shine, I treated him like a burden. Preston had one private moment of pain before he became calm again. Gloria told me much later that after Martin left, Preston cried once, silently, with one hand over his face. Then he wiped his eyes, asked for tea, and said, "Let what I built serve the people who stayed." Calvin's world looked intoxicating in the beginning because it was built to deceive women like me. The penthouse in Boston was first rented under one of his failing business entities, but within weeks, he convinced me the lease should be transferred in my name because his credit was tied up in temporary restructuring. He said it with such confidence that I felt foolish questioning him. The black Mercedes, the rooftop restaurants, the vintage wine, the promises of Hampton's weekends and Aspen winters were all part of his costume. Some nights he paid with one card, some nights with another. Sometimes he used cash from gambling wins. More often, I later discovered, he used advances, borrowed money, and my own credit. He downloaded betting apps and hid them behind finance folders on his phone. He took calls from men whose voices changed his expression. He claimed they were investors. I chose to believe that because disbelief would have forced me to look at what I had done. For a few weeks, I felt electric. I posted photographs of Calvin and me in matching cashmere coats, our hands linked over cocktails, Boston glittering behind us. I wrote captions about choosing happiness and new beginnings. Calvin told me I had escaped a life of slow grief. He said, "You deserve a man who knows how to live." I repeated those words whenever guilt rose in my throat. But the first cracks appeared quickly. Dinners became less frequent. His urgent meetings multiplied. His phone buzzed through meals, and he stepped away to answer in low tones. Then came the money questions. At first, it was a business expense that would be paid back within days. Then it was an investor dinner, a legal fee, a wire transfer delay. I gave him one credit card to use just for emergencies. He maxed it within a month. When I confronted him, Calvin smiled as if I were a child frightened by shadows. Calvin said, "Yolanda, these are short-term setbacks. You have seen the deals I am working on. Once they close, we will never worry again." After that, things began disappearing. A diamond bracelet Preston had bought me after my father's funeral went missing first. Calvin claimed he had taken it for insurance appraisal because pieces like that needed updated valuation. That sounded believable enough to quiet me for 2 days. Then a handbag vanished, then a watch, then earrings I had worn to a hospital fundraiser years earlier. I found a pawn receipt folded inside one of Calvin's jacket pockets, and when I asked him about it, he kissed my forehead and said, "Do not start acting suspicious now. I am handling pressure you do not understand." I wanted to slap him. I wanted to leave. Instead, I stayed because leaving Calvin would mean admitting that I had destroyed my marriage for a fraud. Pride is expensive when it is the only thing holding a person upright. Then Preston died. I did not receive a personal call from Denise because by then I had filed for legal separation, changed my address, ignored Martin's formal letters, and refused to answer Gloria's one attempt to reach me. I learned through the news like everyone else outside the circle of people who had loved him properly. I was sitting in Calvin's penthouse with a glass of wine when the headline appeared on my phone. Boston business leader Preston Whitaker remembered for quiet philanthropy and transformative logistics work. My hand froze. The article included photographs from a funeral at a stone church in Back Bay. Long black cars, solemn faces, Denise standing composed beside Martin Whitfield, Gloria seated near the front with Preston's staff around her like family. I was nowhere in any photograph. I told myself that was because I had not known. Then I read further. The article mentioned his business holdings, private investments, charitable commitments, and an estimated estate valued at more than $500 million. $500 million. I read the number again until the digits blurred. I had known Preston was successful, but I had mistaken restraint for limitation. I had thought the modest life he preferred meant that was all he could afford. The article linked to another profile, then another, each revealing more. Commercial properties in Chicago and San Francisco, logistics contracts across the country, venture investments, scholarships funded anonymously, hospital donations made without press releases. My throat tightened, but not from grief at first. It was shock. Ugly, selfish shock. Calvin walked in while I was reading, tossing his coat over the sofa. Calvin said, "Why are you looking like you saw a ghost?" I whispered, "Preston was worth more than $500 million. Calvin's eyebrows lifted. For 1 second, I saw a calculation flash across his face. Then his mouth curved. Calvin said, "And you walked away from that for me?" The words sounded almost amused, but there was contempt underneath. I said I did not know. Calvin chuckled and poured himself a drink. Calvin said, "That is the funniest part. A man like Preston did not need to show you what he had. You should have paid attention." That night, while Calvin slept, I sat in the living room scrolling through every article I could find. The more I learned, the smaller I felt. Every designer shoe in my closet, every restaurant photograph, every glass of champagne seemed cheap beside what I had thrown away. But what hurt most was not only the money. Buried in one article was a quote from a hospital director saying Preston had visited sick children quietly for years. Another mentioned that he had paid off the medical debt of several employees without letting them know. I remembered him coming home late and saying only that he had handled a few things. I used to roll my eyes because he never made his good deeds sound exciting. Now I saw that he had been building meaning while I had been chasing mirrors. I tried to talk to Calvin about our future the next morning. I hinted at commitment, stability, rebuilding. He barely looked up from his phone. Calvin said, "This is not the time to start making demands." That evening he claimed to have a meeting and did not come home. Charges appeared on my card after midnight at a steakhouse near the seaport, then at a hotel lounge. He told me it was a client dinner. 2 nights later, I followed him. I found him at a restaurant bar with a woman in a red dress, his hand resting comfortably on her knee, my watch glittering on her wrist. For a moment, I could not move. Then I walked straight to their table. I said, "That belongs to me." The woman looked at the watch, then at Calvin. Calvin did not even look embarrassed. He leaned back, slow and relaxed, as if I had interrupted something mildly inconvenient. I said, "You're using my cards, my jewelry, my name on that lease, and now you are sitting here with another woman wearing what you stole from me." Calvin's face hardened because the woman was watching. Calvin said, "Lower your voice." I said, "No, I left my husband for you." He laughed then, a cruel, open laugh that made nearby tables turn. Calvin said, "You left a loyal husband worth more than $500 million for a man living on borrowed time, borrowed money, and your credit limit. That was not love, Yolanda. That was stupidity." The woman pulled her hand away from him. My cheeks burned so badly I felt feverish. Calvin leaned closer and lowered his voice just enough to make the words private but sharper. Calvin said, "Preston gave you a name, a home, and a legacy. I gave you attention because you were useful. Do not confuse the two." I slapped him. It was not elegant. It did not restore my dignity. Calvin stood, adjusted his jacket, and said, "You should have stayed with the dying man. At least he had enough class to pretend you mattered." Then he walked out, leaving me with the bill because the reservation had been made under my card. By the end of that week, Calvin was gone from the penthouse. He took his clothes, the last of my jewelry, 2 handbags, and a folder of documents I later realized contained account details he had no right to possess. He stopped answering my calls. His leased Mercedes disappeared. Men began calling my phone, asking about debts he had attached to my name. The penthouse lease became an anchor. First came the late notices, then the collection calls, then the letter threatening legal action. The life Calvin promised me did not end with one dramatic explosion. It collapsed in stages, each one more humiliating than the last. I tried to go back to Preston before he died, and that is the part one did not tell anyone for a long time. After I read the first rumors about his estate, but before the obituary confirmed everything, I went to the brownstone. I told myself I was going because he deserved an apology. That was not the whole truth. Some part of me wanted to know if the door was still open. Gloria answered and looked at me, as if she had been expecting the day, but not welcoming it. She said, "He is resting." I said, "Please, I need to speak with him." She left me in the foyer beneath the chandelier I had once chosen and returned after several minutes. Gloria said, "He will see you for 10 minutes. My legs trembled as I walked into his room. Preston was thinner, his skin drawn, but his eyes were clear. The curtains were open. Denise sat near the window and closed her book when I entered, but Preston lifted one hand, and she left without a word. I stood at the foot of his bed. I had rehearsed an apology, but the sight of him stole the polish from my words. I said, "Preston, I made a mistake." He watched me quietly. I said, "I was overwhelmed. I was scared. I did not know how to handle seeing you sick." Preston said, "You handled it by choosing Calvin." I swallowed. I said, "It was not that simple." Preston said, "It was simple enough when you packed the suitcase." There was no cruelty in his voice. That made it worse. I said, "I can come home. I can help now." Preston's expression did not change. He said, "No, Yolanda." The refusal landed softly, but it closed around me like iron. I said, "You will not even let me try?" Preston said, "You had months to try. You chose dinners, photographs, perfume on your coat, and another man's promises. You chose comfort over loyalty. You chose not to be here when I was sick." Tears filled my eyes, partly from shame, partly from panic. I said, "I was your wife." Preston said, "You were. Then you taught me what that meant to you." I gripped the bed rail. I said, "I am sorry." Preston looked at me for a long time, and in that silence, I remembered every cruel word I had thrown at him. I did not sign up to be a nurse. "You're dragging me down. I will not waste my youth." Preston said, "I believe you are sorry now." My breath caught, because for one foolish second, I thought forgiveness was coming. Then he said, "But regret after discovery is not the same as love before loss." I whispered, "What am I supposed to do?" Preston said, "Find what you were looking for." I shook my head. "Please do not say that." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Preston said, "I said it the day you left because I meant it. Not as weakness, not as surrender, as closure." Gloria appeared at the door. My 10 minutes were over. I wanted to fall to my knees, but something in Preston's calm would not allow me to turn my shame into theater. I walked out of that room knowing I had not been rejected in anger. I had been released with finality. After his death, Martin Whitfield sent formal notice through certified mail. The estate documents had entered probate, and I was not named as a beneficiary. I called his office anyway, standing in my small kitchen with unpaid bills spread across the counter. Martin's assistant scheduled a brief call. His voice was professional, not dramatic. Martin said, "Mrs. Whitaker, the revised trust documents and will are clear. Mr. Whitaker cited your legal separation, the prenuptial waiver, and your abandonment during his illness. You are not included as a beneficiary." I said, "So I get nothing?" Martin paused. Martin said, "You will receive copies of the relevant notices. Any questions may be directed in writing through counsel." I wanted him to sound cruel so I could hate him. He did not. He sounded like a man carrying out instructions left by someone who had thought carefully. Before ending the call, he added, Mr. Whitaker provided generously for those who remained in his care and service. I knew he meant Gloria. I knew he meant Denise. I knew he did not mean me. My downfall became visible slowly, then all at once. The penthouse went first. I stood in the empty living room on the last day, listening to my heels click against bare hardwood while movers carried out furniture I could no longer afford to keep. The skyline beyond the windows looked almost insulting, bright, and indifferent. I moved into a small one-bedroom in a plain Boston neighborhood. Not tragic, not cinematic, just ordinary in a way my pride found unbearable. The grocery store had flickering lights. The radiator groaned. The single window faced the brick wall of another building. I told myself it was temporary. I applied for receptionist positions, administrative assistant roles, event coordinator jobs, and sales work. My resume looked thinner than I expected. I had hosted charity dinners beside Preston, helped arrange donor seating, selected flowers, smiled beside sponsors, and called it experience. Hiring managers called it vague. Rejections arrived politely when they arrived at all. After months of applications, I found temporary work where I could. I worked as a hostess twice a week. I took shifts at a boutique that sold dresses to women who looked like the woman I used to be. One afternoon, a customer stared at me for several seconds while I folded a silk blouse. She said, "Do I know you from the Whitaker Gala at the museum?" My hands tightened around the fabric. I said, "I do not think so." She smiled uncertainly and moved away. I stood behind the counter, feeling the full distance between the woman who once entered rooms on Preston's arm and the woman pretending not to be recognized under fluorescent lights. That night, I walked home because I could not afford a rideshare. Rain began before I reached my building, and by the time I climbed the stairs, my shoes were soaked. I remembered Preston kneeling years earlier to buckle the strap of a sandal. I was too impatient to fix myself. At the time, I had laughed and told him he was too careful. Now the memory hurt more than any bill. News of Preston's foundation followed me everywhere. First, I saw an article about the pediatric wing at Boston Children's Hospital. Denise cut the ribbon beside doctors, nurses, and children holding paper flowers. Gloria stood near the edge of the photograph, wearing a navy dress and the kind of quiet pride that did not need a caption. Then came the scholarship ceremony in Detroit, where students spoke about receiving opportunities they never thought possible. Then a community learning center in Roxbury opened under Preston's name. I watched a video of Denise giving a speech there. Denise said, "My brother believed love was proven by presence. He believed loyalty was not what people said when life was easy, but what they did when staying became inconvenient." I closed my laptop so hard the screen flickered. Those words found me exactly where I lived. A month later, I tried to attend one of the foundation events. It was a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a rehabilitation center funded partly through Preston's estate. I told myself I wanted closure. I wore the best dress I had left, one I had not pawned, because Preston once said the color made me look peaceful. At the entrance, a young woman checked names on a tablet. I gave mine softly. Her expression changed just enough for me to notice. She called over an older staff member, a man who had worked with Preston for years. He recognized me immediately. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Mrs. Whitaker, this is a private foundation event." I said, I was his wife. The man's face remained composed. He said, "The invited family and honorees are already inside." Through the glass doors, I saw Denise being greeted by board members. I saw Gloria embraced by nurses. I saw a framed photograph of Preston near the stage, smiling with that steady warmth I had once treated as ordinary. The man said, "I am sorry, but I cannot admit you." People arriving behind me slowed down. Someone whispered my name. I turned and walked away with every inch of my exclusion visible. That public denial hurt more than the probate call because it showed me what I had truly lost. Not simply money, not simply property, legacy, respect, a place beside a man whose life had meant something beyond comfort. I had imagined myself standing at those openings, hand in hand with Preston, receiving gratitude, helping carry his name forward. Instead, his sister and staff stood where I might have stood, and they deserved it. That was the part that made my bitterness useless. Denise had earned her place through quiet presence. Gloria had earned hers through service. I had forfeited mine with every night I chose Calvin's rented luxury over Preston's weakening hand. In the quiet hours, regret stopped being abstract. It became specific. I remembered Preston leaving peeled oranges beside my laptop because I forgot to eat when planning events. I remembered him reading beside me in bed, lowering the volume of his jazz records when I had headaches. I remembered him bringing home a scarf from Chicago because I once mentioned liking that shade of green. I remembered him holding my hand in a hospital hallway after our miscarriage, saying, "We do not have to be strong tonight." I remembered him warming my side of the bed in winter. I remembered him calling me from business trips just to describe the sky outside his hotel window. None of those memories had anything to do with $500 million. That was why they hurt. Calvin had taken money, jewelry, credit, and pride. But I had thrown away tenderness with my own hands. Calvin's disappearance became its own slow punishment. He left no forwarding address, only debts and rumors. I heard from a former acquaintance that he had been seen in Miami with another woman, then in Las Vegas, trying to attach himself to investors who no longer returned his calls. Men continued calling me for weeks, asking for payments he owed. One threatened legal action over money I had never seen. My credit collapsed. My savings were gone. The jewelry Preston gave me had either been pawned by Calvin or sold by me to survive. There were no brunch invitations, no rooftop photographs, no women leaning close to ask where I bought my dress. The friends who once envied my curated life became unavailable with remarkable speed. Some crossed the street when they saw me. Others replied days later with messages so brief they felt like locked doors. Without Preston's name beside mine, I learned how little of that world had ever belonged to me. Spring came, but nothing softened. I cleaned my apartment methodically because order was one of the few things I could still control. I made lists of applications, payment deadlines, grocery prices, and bus routes. I stopped speaking aloud unless someone at work required an answer. Sometimes, from my window, I watched couples pass on the sidewalk, hands linked, heads bent together, moving through ordinary evenings without knowing how priceless ordinary could become. I used to think ordinary love was not enough. I used to think devotion needed sparkle to matter. Now I understood that peace had been sitting across from me at breakfast for years, asking if I wanted more coffee. On a quiet Sunday, I found the old honeymoon album in the back of my closet. Maui sunlight, wind-blown hair, Preston laughing with his whole face open. A photograph of us in a small roadside diner, my head on his shoulder, his hand around mine. Another of him in our kitchen years later, flipping pancakes badly while I wore his shirt and teased him for burning the edges. Small, ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time now felt like evidence from a life I had failed to understand. My fingers stopped on a picture of Preston in his study. He was looking up from a book, smiling at me, as if I were the safest part of his day. I pressed my thumb over the image and whispered, "I am sorry." The apartment gave nothing back. Months after his death, a foundation newsletter arrived in my email by mistake, or perhaps because my name had once been on an old event list. I opened it even though I knew it would hurt. The lead photograph showed the completed Whitaker Community Learning Center in Roxbury, its glass doors shining in the afternoon sun. Children stood on the steps with backpacks. Denise stood beside a bronze plaque bearing Preston's name. Gloria was listed among the honored guests for her decade of service to the Whitaker household and her care during his final illness. At the bottom was a quotation from Preston, "Let what I built serve the people who stayed." I read it until the words blurred. That evening, I took the bus past the center because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I sat near the window in a coat with a loose button, watching the city move around me. When the bus slowed at the corner, I saw the building glowing from within. Students sat at tables. A security guard opened the door for an elderly woman. On the wall near the entrance hung Preston's portrait. He looked exactly as I remembered him before sickness thinned him. Calm, dignified, quietly certain. I did not get off the bus. I did not belong inside. As it pulled away, his face slid out of view, replaced by my reflection in the glass. That was when I finally understood the sentence he gave me the day I left. "I hope you find what you were looking for." I had thought it was weakness. I had thought it meant he was too tired to fight for me. But Preston had not been surrendering. He had been closing the door without slamming it. He had been giving me the life I claimed to want and removing me from the legacy I had proven I did not value. I had told him I did not sign up to be a nurse, as if he had become a burden instead of remaining my husband. In the end, I was not punished by his anger. I was left with the full weight of my own choice. Preston died loved, honored, and remembered. Calvin vanished with what he could steal, and I kept moving through the city with his calm words following me everywhere. Not loud, not cruel, never fading. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.